No. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Ventatron speaking, and today we are answering this question, but we are discussing ancient forms of government and governance in the classical period. Now, words such as republic, democracy may sound modern because we still use them, but they are in fact very, very ancient. And up to a certain extent, even though whenever we think of democracy, we immediately connect it to ancient Greece, and then when we think about republic, we connect it to ancient Rome. It's very likely that even though democracy was implemented in a very unique way in Greece, and it is in fact the most famous example of ancient democracy, it is very likely that it's a naturally forming ancestral type of government that may be, up to a certain extent, more common than monarchies the further back we go. Did I get you interested? Okay, so first and foremost, let's define democracy, and then we will create a strong demarcation between modern democracies and ancient democracies, that even though they share the same term, are not the same thing. They are related, up to a certain extent. Already, dictionary definitions from Oxford Languages tells us, democracy noun, a system of government by the whole population, or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. And then we've got several other options. A state governed by democracy, blah, 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 control of an organization or group by the majority of its members. What does the Merriam-Webster tell us? Democracy, government by the people, rule of the majority. In fact, rule of the people could be the translation of it. Demos and kratos being the words used. And then we are told a form of government in which the people elect the representatives to make decisions, policies, laws, etc. according to law. A form of government in which the people vote directly against or in favor or decisions, policies, laws, etc. Now, the last one is interesting because if you think about it, there is a strong difference already between representative democracy and pure or direct democracy. In fact, oftentimes when we talk about modern democracy, we are talking about a form of representative democracy in the sense that the people, or the majority of eligible members of any group or state or nation, elect through their personal vote their representative, president in office in this case. But we don't vote for the policies. We do not choose the laws. We do not make decisions whether it come foreign affairs or even going into war. And here this is slightly mentioned when we read political, social, or economic equality, the absence of hereditary or arbitrary class distinction of privileges, and then we read from Karin Scalo, I grew up in the pure democracy of a public grade school where everybody brought a Valentine for everybody on Valentine's Day, so we should feel equally loved. It's interesting because he's using the word pure democracy. This is a different scenario, of course, but what is a pure democracy and how does it differentiate from modern representative democracies? Keeping in mind that when we talk about Athenian democracy, the most documented one when it comes to the city-states and the polis in ancient Greece, we are talking about a form of pure democracy, which is different from how it is today. Verifying you're a human. A machine asking a human if he is a machine. Goodness gracious. I thought it was supposed to be the other way around. Alright, pure democracy, a political system in which laws and policies are made and voted for directly by citizens rather than by politicians. And this is how it was in ancient Greece. And that is one of the reasons why, if you really look at it, Rome functioned a bit more like modern day. So in other words, in the Roman Republican system, people, usually gentes, but people with a certain importance, they voted their representatives and then they decided the policies and did what they did. So here we read the US is a republic, not a pure democracy. This is correct. Now, whether or not a republic is also a form of democracy or not would get us into definitional loopholes that I'm not particularly interested in, but for sure, the US is not a pure democracy. By the way it functions is in fact closer to the way the Roman Republic functioned, even though they are still different since classical antiquity, modern period. So since the question to this video was whether or not women had any access to voting or any sort of direct power, not indirect through how important her husband or father is, but direct power within the Athenian pure democratic system, the answer, as I said, is no. And that is because Athenian democracy explicitly excluded women from political participation. Despite being called a democracy, Athens practiced what we would today consider a very limited form of political participation that excluded, in fact, the vast majority of its population. And this is an important aspect when discussing who and what percentages could vote. Those who did have access to voting had more influence than today's population, but the numbers of people that were included in that group was smaller. So having established that the first difference is the fact that women in modern democracies do vote, whereas in ancient democracy they didn't, who else was allowed to vote? When it comes to participation to voting, Athenian democracy was restricted to adult male citizens. They are called politai, who were born to Athenian citizen parents, both mother and father, were over 18 years old, they were not slaves, and they were not foreign residents. There are still some overlap and some similarities. Age verification is something we have in common. I mean, even today, if you're 12, you can't vote. It doesn't matter if you're a citizen, it doesn't matter where you're from. The other thing is, as I say, the fact that you need to be a citizen in order to vote. That's one thing that we have in common as well. The fact that women couldn't vote is different. The fact that slaves couldn't vote. Now, of course, slavery has been abolished. Now, I know what you're going to say. Some forms of slavery technically still exist if you consider people who are imprisoned and then indentured servants. Sure, okay, fantastic. But when we say slavery being abolished, we mean what people mostly think about as a slave, whether it be an ancient slave, like in the case of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, or even freaking any other ancient civilization, in fact, or whether it be specifically chattel slavery. Regardless, those kind of slaves couldn't vote then, couldn't vote now, even if they existed, but they don't exist anymore today. So, having established this, what are the percentages? And generally speaking, we could anticipate a 10 to 15% of residing population would be able to vote within Athens, and then would be allowed to publicly and actively participate in democratic institutions. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. An interesting aspect that we need to discuss now is that if we contrast this with Sparta, even though Sparta was far less democratic than Athens, Spartan women enjoyed more freedom of movement. They could own property and receive physical education, although they still lacked formal political rights, just like the rest of Greece and the planet. So, having established this, what are the things that ancient Greek women were excluded from, and what were the things in which instead they could exercise a certain level of influence? When it comes to the exclusion, Athenians believed women were naturally suited for the domestic sphere, called oikos, rather than the public sphere, which was called, of course, polis. And we have quite a few writings when it comes to the philosopher Aristotle, if you want to go a little deeper on this. With that being said, even though they did not have direct political influence, of course they could have indirect political influence by the way they would persuade their husbands, fathers and brothers, but also some women held important religious positions, as priestesses sometimes, and wealthy women could wield informal influence through their relatives. And we often see this represented in dramatic literature. Another way to look at this is that from the perspective of ancient Greece and the ancient Greek, this was not a form of exclusion at all. And it was connected to the ancient Greek belief of separate spheres for men and women. Some things were considered to be masculine domain, other things were considered to be feminine domains. And for the Greeks, these were quite well defined. In other words, in their society, this was a form of natural order, males and females having different roles that were supposed to be complementary but separate. Now, of course, when you read the actual classics and you read the words of some authors, there will be a few of them that actually say things that may sound quite strong and in fact unreasonable. That doesn't mean, however, that the entirety of the population would reflect the thoughts or words of a specific author we are reading. And this is always something we need to consider. it is difficult really to figure out how popular or widespread a specific belief is if all we know about that belief is that it was expressed by a specific philosopher or thinker, in fact, sometimes a politician or a rhetorician. These should be considered as people of a certain echelon, and some of the things they believed may have not been reflected not only by the entirety of the populations. There would have been factions and different ways of thinking, just like there are today, but also specifically perhaps even by other classes, as of course, just like in any other society of this time, everything was extremely hierarchical. Anyways, I hope that this answered your question and your curiosity. Thank you very much for watching, and remember to subscribe. Goodbye.